Ukraine has just liberated a massive amount of territory from Russian control, not metaphorically, not in some abstract sense, literally. In the span of weeks, Ukrainian forces have reclaimed over 480 square kilometers along the Oleksandrivka and Huliai-Poli axes in southern Ukraine. 12 settlements now fly the Ukrainian flag again. Entire defensive belts that Moscow poured billions into building have been shattered. But this is not simply another local advance on a map. What you are witnessing right now is the visible collapse of Russia's entire defensive doctrine under the weight of Ukrainian adaptation and Western-enabled precision. This is the moment when every assumption Putin's generals made about static lines, massed artillery, and endless manpower has been proven catastrophically wrong. And it gets even more serious from here. Let that sink in for a moment. 480 square kilometers. That is territory larger than many European cities combined. It is ground that Russia claimed was fortified beyond reach. It is ground they said could never be taken back. And yet, Ukrainian forces have done exactly that, not through brute force alone, but through a masterclass in modern combined arms warfare that has left the Russian army exposed at every level. This is not a tactical incident. This is a case study in doctrinal failure versus doctrinal superiority. It is proof that Ukraine understands the battlefield of the 21st century in ways Russia never will. Pull the lens back and you see the larger pattern. Every Russian miscalculation is now compounding into strategic catastrophe. Let me walk you through what this actually means at the strategic level. Because the mainstream coverage, the talking heads on cable news, they are missing the forest for the trees. They see villages changing hands and call it a seesaw battle. I see something far more decisive. This liberation did not happen by accident. It happened because Russia's entire concept of defense, rooted in Soviet-era thinking, has been rendered obsolete by Ukrainian innovation, courage, and the quiet integration of Western systems that Moscow still cannot counter. What happened here proves that Russia's so-called meat grinder strategy was never a strategy at all. It was a delusion. Go back to the Russian assumptions that set the stage for this disaster. When Moscow launched its full-scale invasion, they believed their defensive lines in southern Ukraine would hold forever. They built layered fortifications, minefields kilometers deep, dragon's teeth anti-tank obstacles, concrete bunkers, and overlapping fields of fire from artillery and drones. They assumed that sheer numbers of troops, endless waves of mobilized conscripts, and the sheer weight of Soviet-era artillery would make any Ukrainian countermove suicidal. They told themselves that Ukraine would bleed out trying to retake ground, just as they had in 2022 and 2023. They believed their rear areas were safe, their logistics unbreakable, their command and control immune to disruption. These were not minor errors in planning. These were foundational doctrinal lies that their entire campaign rested upon. And it gets even more serious from here, because those assumptions were never based on the reality of this war. They were based on the fantasy that Ukraine would fight like a conventional army of the past, that Western support would waver, and that Russian mass would always triumph over quality. Russia ignored the lessons of their own failures in Kharkiv and Kherson. They ignored the way Ukrainian forces had already adapted to drone warfare, electronic jamming, and precision strikes. They convinced themselves that fortifying static positions would turn southern Ukraine into an unbreakable fortress. What they actually created was a target-rich environment for the very tactics Ukraine has perfected. Now let us examine the chronology of how this illusion was dismantled step by step, because the sequence reveals everything. It began in late January when Ukrainian commanders identified the weakest points in the Russian lines around Oleksandrivka. Rather than launching a head-on assault that Russia expected, Ukrainian forces used a sophisticated combination of drone reconnaissance, small unit infiltration, and precision fires to probe and weaken the defenses. They did not commit their main forces until the conditions were set. By early February, the first breakthroughs occurred. Ukrainian assault groups, supported by FPV drones and artillery, began peeling back the outer layers of Russian positions. Dozens of Russian vehicles were destroyed in the opening phases alone, not in mass tank battles, but picked off individually as their crews attempted to maneuver in terrain they no longer controlled. The pace accelerated through March. Ukrainian forces liberated village after village with clinical efficiency, 12 settlements in total. Each advance was preceded by meticulous preparation, jamming Russian communications, suppressing their artillery with counter-battery fire, and using cheap, expendable drones to overwhelm expensive Russian air defenses. What looked like incremental gains on a map was actually a rolling collapse. Russian reserves rushed forward to plug gaps, found themselves under constant attack from loitering munitions before they could even establish new positions. Russian command posts, once thought safe dozens of kilometers behind the lines, were struck with surgical precision. By mid-March, the liberated area had grown to over 400 square kilometers, and still the Russian high command refused to acknowledge the scale of the failure. Here's where the doctrinal pedagogy becomes crystal clear. Russia's doctrine demanded that they hold ground at all costs. No flexible defense. No maneuver to better positions. Just stand and die in place. Ukrainian forces, by contrast, have embraced the principles of combined arms operations that I taught for decades. Find the seam, exploit it with speed and surprise, then consolidate and expand. They integrated Western-provided systems in ways Russia never anticipated. HIMARS and other precision rockets disrupted Russian logistics nodes. Western intelligence, shared in real time, allowed Ukrainian commanders to see the battlefield with clarity that Moscow's rigid hierarchy could never match. The result was not just territory gained, it was momentum seized. And it gets even more serious from here, because this is not isolated to one sector. The liberation along the Oleksandrivka axis has had cascading effects across the entire front. Russian forces in other sectors, already stretched thin, have been forced to divert units southward to prevent a complete rout. That diversion has weakened their efforts around Pokrovsk and Kupiansk. It has created new vulnerabilities elsewhere. What Russia thought was a contained problem in the south has become a theater-wide hemorrhage. Their so-called Surovikin line, once touted as impregnable, now lies in ruins. The psychological impact on Russian troops cannot be overstated. When elite units see their fortified positions bypassed or overrun by forces they were told were inferior, morale collapses. Desertions rise, command cohesion fractures. Let us turn now to the industrial and state-level consequences, because this territorial liberation is not merely a battlefield event. It is a strategic body blow to the Russian war machine. Every square kilometer reclaimed represents lost economic value, lost prestige, and lost manpower. Russia has poured hundreds of thousands of troops into holding these lines. Now those troops are either dead, captured, or in chaotic retreat. Their equipment losses are staggering. Hundreds of armored vehicles, artillery pieces, and electronic warfare systems destroyed or abandoned in the fighting. Replacing them is becoming impossible under Western sanctions and Ukraine's deep strikes on Russian production facilities. Pull the lens back further. This success forces Moscow into an impossible strategic choice. Do they reinforce the South at the expense of other fronts, or do they let the collapse continue and risk a broader unraveling? Either way, their industrial base is cracking. Their economy, already strained by war spending and sanctions, cannot sustain the rate of attrition this kind of fighting demands. Ukrainian adaptation has turned the war into a contest Russia was never prepared to win. Their reliance on North Korean shells and Iranian drones is not strength. It is desperation. And every Ukrainian success like this one exposes that desperation to the world. The real question is whether Moscow understands the magnitude of what has just happened. Their propaganda machine is working overtime to downplay it, claiming minor tactical adjustments or even denying losses altogether. But the geolocated footage tells a different story. The liberated villages, the abandoned Russian positions, the columns of retreating forces under drone attack, these are not fabricated images. They are the visible evidence of a military that has lost the initiative and is now reacting instead of dictating. Now we reach the climactic turning point operation that made all of this possible. In the final phase of this counteroffensive, Ukrainian forces executed a textbook combined arms breakthrough that will be studied in war colleges for years to come. They identified a critical seam in the Russian defenses near Huliopol, using a mix of electronic warfare to blind Russian sensors, massed FPV drone swarms to neutralize artillery and command vehicles, and highly mobile mechanized infantry supported by Western armor. They punched through in a matter of hours. Russian reserves, already depleted from earlier fighting, were unable to respond in time. What followed was a rapid exploitation phase. Ukrainian columns advanced deep into the rear, cutting supply lines and isolating Russian strongpoints. Within days, the entire sector had collapsed. Over 480 square kilometers changed hands. 12 settlements were liberated, and the Russian high command was left scrambling for explanations. This operation was not lucky. It was the culmination of months of preparation, intelligence dominance, and doctrinal evolution. Ukrainian commanders understood that modern war rewards speed, surprise, and decentralization. Russian commanders, shackled to centralized control and outdated Soviet manuals, could not adapt fast enough. The hidden military variable here was Ukrainian mastery of the drone artillery infantry triad. Cheap drones act as both eyes and teeth, turning what used to be a slow, costly advance into a lightning strike. Russia has no answer to this at scale. Their attempts at jamming are inconsistent. Their air defenses are overwhelmed. Their troops are left exposed and demoralized. Let me state this with the clarity it deserves. What Ukraine has achieved here confirms the larger pattern that has defined this entire conflict. Ukrainian forces adapt faster, fight smarter, and integrate technology more effectively than their opponent. Russia's entire strategy was built on the belief that time was on their side, that attrition would favor the larger power. That belief has now been shattered. The liberation of these 480 square kilometers is not the end. It is the beginning of the end for Russia's ability to sustain this war on their terms. And what happens next changes everything. Russian forces are already showing signs of panic. They are rushing reinforcements from other sectors, further weakening their positions. Their logistics are strained to the breaking point. Their political leadership is facing mounting pressure from within. Meanwhile, Ukraine has demonstrated to the world and to its own people that victory is not only possible, but inevitable if the West maintains its resolve. The moral judgment of history is already being written. This was never a contest of equals. It was a contest between a nation fighting for its survival with ingenuity and courage and an aggressor state built on lies, corruption, and obsolete thinking. As someone who spent decades studying how armies move, how doctrines evolve, and how wars are truly won or lost, I can tell you this with absolute certainty: the Russian military model has failed. It failed in the opening weeks of the invasion. It failed in the great retreats of 2022, and it is failing spectacularly now in the face of Ukrainian adaptation. The assumptions that Putin and his generals bet their regime on have been exposed as fantasy. The battlefield does not lie, and right now the battlefield is speaking with unmistakable clarity. What you have just witnessed is the strategic prosecutor's verdict on Russia's war. Guilty of catastrophic miscalculation at every level, Ukraine is not merely surviving. It is advancing, innovating, and reclaiming its land. The path ahead will not be easy. There will be counterattacks. There will be difficult days, but the momentum has shifted decisively. The liberated territory stands as proof that the adaptation race has a clear winner, and it is not Moscow. Stay with us, because those questions about what comes next do not have simple answers. The next phase of this war will test both sides in new ways. But one thing is certain: the pattern of Russian failure and Ukrainian resilience is now irreversible. History will record these days not as a minor skirmish, but as the turning point where the illusion of Russian power finally shattered on the fields of southern Ukraine. The war continues, but the outcome is no longer in doubt. Ukraine is winning the adaptation race, and Russia is paying the price for every outdated assumption it refused to abandon.